A pleasure to meet all at last. And for this piece of films I should have talked about years ago, with all that I've said about the Terminator and Captain Underpants, Clueless, etc., we could probably take a bit of a turn back to the early 70s again. Only because I actually had managed to rewatch something for the first time in over 15 years. The Omega Man from 1971, starring the likes of Charlton Heston, Rosalind Cash, and a good handful of other actors, centering on a supposed post-apocalyptic life outside of the likes of what a normal life would be like. We can happily consider the Omega Man to be quite notable, not only because this was a few years after Heston's last big success, Planet of the Apes, but most of us can always remember this film being a unique example of how the likes of science and reality seem to clash together in a number of ways. A cultist set of beliefs in correlation to the likes of one man whom supposedly was left unaffected by a number of different issues. They of course had originally spawned from a plentiful amount of different contagions, as a certain news article had actually unfolded at some point afterwards where the film takes place. More importantly though, we have ourselves Charlton Heston at the start of the film driving around in the convertible at first, but as the plot carries on, we do eventually see him making contact with members of what is known as the family. They are, of course, a group of changed individuals, and not just changed because of the way they dress and the way that their skin is very pale, almost albino, sort of. But this is actually the recurring theme that we see in this film. We see Dr. Robert Neville, played by Charlton Heston, going up against the family, whom, of course, are out to kill him. The main motive that we see as the film goes on is that the family sees Robert Neville as not only an unbeliever of their many prodigies and their religious beliefs, but they of course do see Neville as a scientist, aka a man whom is of course against their ideologies. Now granted, when an apocalyptic event does take place, whether it be a meteor strike, a massive ice or firestorm, a drought, a war that goes on between multiple countries, there's always the chance that change can show up. And a person's mental state, beliefs, opinions, they can all change. Whether it happens before, during, or even after it all happens. But what all of us can come to the agreement of, everybody's different. Even if we're not in an apocalyptic situation, like right now, when there's basically nothing going wrong right now. There, of course, will still be people out there who express their solemn beliefs in something, or will have their own tastes change over time. There might be some people that might end up changing completely, or maybe slowly increasing the amount of change that goes on. After all, there's a lot of things like influence, someone's role modeling skills, and there's always going to be a million other factors that goes into play. Whatever the case may be though, Neville by day goes out hunting for treasures and occasionally finds supplies in the now ghost town that is of course LA. Yeah, Los Angeles of all cities happens to be the place in which that he not only finds a home mat, but also scours around for certain supplies. And of course, after dark, when the sun begins to set, the family comes around and occasionally plans an attack on Neville himself. Basically speaking, when he gets back home after having issues with his car and he finds a replacement at a used car dealership, which we might as well mention something real quick. 1971 car money, although technically it's the year 1977 as Neville himself records on a log that he has, and he's made thousands of them, as we'll eventually hear. Apparently the car money in that time was around $2,000 in 1977, or possibly just could have been 1971, so to speak, because years after all had passed since the so-called breakdown occurred and the eventual uprise of the family as the fall of humanity came into play. So, a lot of things had happened. This, of course, is one of those films that does center on an old story, a novel in which that does focus on a similar sort of aspect, a cultural phenomenon that began with a massive outbreak resulting in a loss of a majority of humanity, and eventually following along with one survivor who supposedly would be seen as the cure for the massive disease later on. But as we'll see in here, though, the Omega Man, Neville drives away with a Mustang. Kind of a nice little trade. How he was able to fetch the keys from it, wow. You can pretty much imagine today a car dealership is abandoned and you just need to find yourself a new set of wheels. I'm sure the key will be somewhere in the building, right? Anyways, he makes it back to his home, which is pretty much rigged with all sorts of crazy goodies. A TV, a chessboard, and even has his own companion with him. Yeah, he's one of those guys in which that he believes he's the sole survivor of it all and has to make do with life, you know? After all, since humans are social creatures, it seemingly makes sense that he uses a mannequin of all things to talk to, since otherwise his social functionality is going to break down and he will no longer be in a positive mental state. You know? As accommodation / compensation, we end up having to talk to inanimate objects. I mean, remember what happened in Castaway when Tom Hanks had to talk to a volleyball for 4 years? Yeah, it's kind of like that. It is a real life psychiatric phenomenon that occurs when somebody is all alone for years on end, you know? But in any case, though, we do get back and forth between Neville's scouring by day and the family sort of things by night. There is actually a point in which that they bring out a ballista, light it with fire, and all the ammo eventually starts to leak into Neville's room. So he, of course, is thankful to have himself a fire extinguisher as well as a rifle in hand to fight back against the family. But the real twist of things start to come along when a break into monotony occurs. Neville goes out at a clothing store and there's a bunch of mannequins all dressed up in fancy attire when there's a bit of a distinguishment that happens. A live person happens to be in the crowd of mannequins, and when they lock eyes with each other, this other person runs away, and he just can't seem to catch up to her. Yeah, even going into the wild doesn't help very much either. Well, when all is said and done, Neville does try to move on, but he unfortunately is ambushed by the family and then taken in prisoner, where he's humiliated and eventually set to be executed. But things start to change. They start to turn in his direction when the family is suddenly attacked, and the perpetrator apparently was the same woman whom, of course, saw Dr. Neville earlier, and now she's rescuing him. What the reason is for? Well, at first it starts to get a bit tense. The two don't exactly have good respect for each other, and even if they do, it's kind of hard to establish a connection with two different survivors here. I guess you could say that in this instance, this woman, whom is known by Lisa, played by Rosalind Cash, she, of course, seems to be hard to talk to. And it does seem that with the years that happened, with all that hell that happened with the family and all that, life itself could have been pretty difficult for both of them. So I guess you could say it was a bit difficult for things to be reestablished. Having a social life with actual persons rather than some undead cultists. Yeah, kind of freaky when you think about it. Just that kind of break in monotony happens to occur. Well, in all cases though, Lisa and Robert do eventually make arrangements to head on over to their hiding place. Yeah, apparently Lisa has herself a home and there's several other survivors that happen to be there with her. Because of the fact that Neville's place is sort of trashed on account of those ballista rounds that were on fire, he and Lisa do agree to meet with each other for some time, along with the rest of the survivors. They eventually start to talk about somebody out there whom happens to be among the family. Somebody whom, of course, is known by the name of Richie. And this Richie fellow happens to play a bit of a crucial part in all of this. And not only that, but because of Robert Neville's immunity to this contagion that caused the uprising of the family, well, you could say for certainty that Neville just might be the answer to all that has happened so far. Well, so what eventually happens is that even though Neville does explain how he had attempted to take down Matthias and his family before trying out different cures and things, they just didn't seem to work all too well. But it does seem that they might have a chance going forward. So what does eventually take place here is that when Lisa and Neville start to head back towards his own location with his home and all that, the family happen to be ready for him. They restrain him after another ambush happens, and Lisa is eventually found to have been infected. And even worse, Matthias orders his members of the family to start trashing Neville's house. Basically, the TV, the chessboard, and his mannequin friend, and all other things that are in there are all destroyed. Basically making the family believe that his way of science is now gone. And when that happens, even though Neville manages to fight his way out of it and try to get Lisa into the light in order to at least prevent her from really becoming one of them, Matthias happens to be ready. He finds a javelin and throws it at Neville, pinning him against the fountain, causing him to start bleeding out. It's a slow, painful process. But by the time dawn breaks, Lisa basically abandons Neville, and with the rest of those survivors that we saw earlier, they eventually find whatever's left of Neville, and he barely has anything more to say to them before finally dying for good. And as tragic of an ending as that film is, I highly do recommend this. It's got a killer soundtrack with some unique notes of jam and jazz. It's got some good acting taking place. It's got a unique story for what it is. And while some people might think of it as something like The Undead, considering the fact that Night of the Living Dead came out a few years before this, don't you think they would have known what zombies really are? Well, then again, this is a different type of contagion that left people infected and left them with this sort of cultist ideology that the family supposedly itself happens to be. And when all is put together here, we can consider the Omega Man to be one of a kind. Not just any film from the early 70s, but Charlton Heston, baby. A few years after Planet of the Apes, nonetheless. But for my final scoring of the Omega Man, we'll simply give it at 8.3 out of 10.1. And I feel like that covers it all. So, make sure to like, subscribe, comment, follow me wherever you can find me, and stay on the Hollywood side.